The respiratory system is chapter 28. So let's just look in depth at what we're doing right now, which is breathing. So whether you're aware of it or not, you need to breathe in order to live. And we know that we can change our breathing. We can breathe fast, we can breathe slow, we can calm ourselves or our parasympathetic nervous system when we take a slow, deep breath. But what you might not be aware of is you need to breathe in order to bring that oxygen in, to move that oxygen all throughout our body with the help of our cardiovascular system, with the help of our endocrine system, with the help of our nervous system, so that everything works together just so you can take a breath. In this chapter, we're going to look at some different areas of our respiratory system, from our nose down into our lungs and a couple extra parts along the way. The functions of our respiratory system is, yes, to help us breathe, but we have other things for it to do too. We have to exchange the oxygen and the carbon dioxide, those gases. We do want to be able to smell things, like right now I'm drinking coffee, so I'm going to be able to smell my coffee, so that's olfaction or olfactory that's happening. I want to be able to talk, so my sound production is part of my respiratory system, and I want my breath to maintain normalcy inside my body, my homeostasis. So our respiratory system has 4 functions, not very many, but all extremely important for us. This slide has a couple different views, so this is what's on 668 and 669, but we're going to use this as we start to talk about some of the parts of our respiratory system. So first of all, I want you to notice on the picture that's on page 668 that we divide our respiratory system into the upper respiratory system and the lower respiratory system, or the upper respiratory tract and lower respiratory tract. So that's on the right side. So please make sure that you notice that. The left side is the first part of the upper respiratory tract that we're going to talk about. So this starts on page 667 with our nose, our nasal cavity. We have an anterior part, which is our nostrils, and we have a posterior part, which is the entry down into the pharynx, which is a little lower. So our nose is more than what we think of. Our nasal cavity is where our inhale comes in. In the second paragraph, it describes how the air is warmed as it passes over our blood vessels. It's moistened by cells that are helping to collect the hairs or the particles on the hairs of our nose, and etc. So I do want you to read through that to make sure that you know what the hair-like projections inside our nose are called. It's not just nose hairs, so I want you to be aware of that. But because of how the air enters our nasal cavity, it is considered our air conditioning chamber because it's changing the air as it comes in. Also in that paragraph is the correct term for a nosebleed, so please make sure that you notice that. On the very bottom of 667, it starts with the sinuses, or our paranasal sinuses. So on your screen, it's that picture that's on the lower right-hand side, but you also can see this on page 669. So you can see where the different sinus areas are located, which is why when we have a sinus problem, our air-filled sinuses are plugged up because they are filled with air normally, because this is the respiratory system and the air needs to move through those sinuses. So sinuses are lightening our skull, they're helping us with our sound, and they are named for where they're located. So if you look at that picture on the bottom of 669, you can see the frontal, ethmoid, maxillary, sphenoid. So all of those areas are different. I do want you to know where they're located. I want you to know what the paranasal sinuses are, but now it kind of maybe makes sense when people say they have a sinus infection or they got something going on with their sinuses. It can be located in different areas, and how and why that affects our breathing and how and why it affects our sound. We all know what somebody sounds like when, ooh, you don't sound right type thing. So back to the picture that's on page 668, or you can see it on the top picture on 669. We're going to move on to the pharynx. So I mentioned the pharynx, which is where the nasal entrance, the posterior nares, are located. So this is the throat. It's a muscular tube that's extending down from the nasal cavity into the larynx, which we're going to talk about next. So within the pharynx, there is also a part that connects with the eustachian tubes. So these are a canal that are connecting the middle ear to the nasopharynx. So the eustachian tubes control the pressure within the middle ear. So they're equaling the pressure from the inside and the outside of our body. So that's why when people get an ear infection or they got fluid in their ears, sometimes it throws our balance off. So the pharynx is very important. The picture that's on the top of 669 shows the three different areas of the pharynx. So you can see the eustachian tubes are at the top, and then we have the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. So just the three areas that are basically behind our tongue or in the back of our throat. And that leads us to our larynx, which is the area that we call our voice box. So if you look in the picture on top of 669, on the left-hand side, right below the chin, you can see the larynx. And within that, we have our epiglottis and our glottis. EPI being a prefix that we've had several times, so hopefully that's something that you recognize. But the larynx itself is tissue that is connecting to muscles, different ligaments, and also to the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is what is happening or what is helping the glottis and the epiglottis move. So the glottis itself is the area where the vocal cords or the vocal fold is located. So this is where we vibrate and produce our sound. The epiglottis is the flap that's covering the glottis because epi means upon or above. So the epiglottis is going to help protect that airway when we swallow. So you've probably all had a little time when you swallowed something wrong. The epiglottis is that flap that's covering the glottis, which is trying to help things from entering where it should not be. So there you can, in that picture, you can just see the different areas of the larynx or the voice box, the glottis, the epiglottis, and what is happening to the guardian of the airway there. Now we're going to move into the lower respiratory tract. So just to review, the upper respiratory tract is the nasal cavity, the sinuses, the pharynx, and the larynx. The lower respiratory tract is the trachea and the lungs. So a little less, but that doesn't mean that it's any less complicated. And actually, it branches out into more complicated things. So let's start with the trachea itself. The picture that I have on your screen has the trachea identified, but you can also look back at those pictures on 668 or 669 if you want to see a different view of what the trachea looks like. The trachea itself is what is connecting the larynx down to the bronchi, which the picture on the left-hand side of your screen or the picture on the top of 671 is showing where that bronchi is located. So the trachea itself it's not hard. It is a cartilage, but they are C-shaped cartilage rings because they have to expand when we swallow food. So the trachea itself has those rings, those cartilaginous rings that collapse during pressure from breathing, but then they expand and contract based on what we're swallowing. If it's water, it's going to be different than if it's a big bolus of food. And we'll talk about those things in the digestive chapter, which is chapter 29 coming up next. So back to the trachea. How does it help us breathe? Well, it's connecting from my larynx down into my bronchi, which is our next section. So when you look at that picture on the left-hand side of the screen or on page 671, you can see that we have a right and left bronchi. So two branches. One's on the right, one's on the left. The right side is wider and it has a deeper angle or a steeper angle to it than the left. So because of that, the right side, if you swallow something, it's probably going to go on the right side. Maybe as a kid, you swallowed something you weren't supposed to. If it did go down into your lungs, it's probably more going to be on the right side. But the left side is how it is because of our cardiovascular system or because our heart is sitting there. So from those right and left branches, we go down into smaller branches of the bronchi. These are the bronchioles. So if you look at them, they start to become different colors in that picture. So it's just showing you the different areas because there's upper, there's lower, etc. No, you don't have to learn all those things. You just need to know what they are called. The next smallest part is the alveoli. So this alveoli are the air sacs, which look like little clusters of grapes, but this is where the gas exchange is actually happening. And we have over 300 million alveoli within our lungs. So when you look at that picture, which is on the bottom of 671, or you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, so they just look like little round things. But imagine we have enough of those to cover a handball court or something that is around 1,000 square feet. Not all of us play handball, but we get the idea that there's a lot of them there. So if we empty them all out, they'd cover a lot of space. But this is where the gas exchange is happening within our respiratory tract. So the respiratory membrane that are located within the wall, there is 3 layers for this gas exchange to occur. So within the respiratory membrane, which is on the bottom of 671, you can see it there, we have 3 different areas. We have the alveolar membrane, we have the basement membrane, and we have the capillary wall. These 3 areas are what is located within the entire respiratory membrane. And again, that is the thin layers that help facilitate that gas exchange that happens within those sacs. So we want this membrane to be healthy, so it has to have a surface on the outside of it to help hold that cluster of grapes from sticking one to another. So there is a surfactant, it's a fluid, a surface tension fluid that is helping. It is a sticky substance, but it's also helped to provide so that my grapes don't stick together or my alveoli sacs are able to exchange that gas. So we want to make sure that that happens within our lungs. So these little sacs are super important. This is where all of it exchanges. On the outside of where all this stuff is located is our lungs. So you can look at the picture back on 668 if you want to see what the lungs look like. You can see the difference between the right and the left lung. You can also see the difference between the right and left bronchi and see how they're shaped differently. But our lungs in general, those are the primary organs of respiration. So they go from our clavicle or our collarbone down on the inside of our rib cage. Our right lung has 3 lobes to it. The left lung has 2 lobes. And that's again because on the left side we have that different shape because our heart is located there. The outside of our lungs also need to have some fluid on it so that they can move freely. So they have a serous fluid that reduces the friction in the layers of the lung wall. Just like on the alveoli sacs, we have that fluid that's on the outside helping to maintain how everything is moving. The very last part before we get on to how we breathe is on the top of page 672. There's a little arrow area that might help you keep all of the parts of the respiratory tract in place. The nose, the nasal cavity, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli. And then the lungs, don't forget about the lungs. So they don't have that on there, but that just might help you remember all of those parts of the upper and lower respiratory tracts. Breathing. So simple. Just a process of bringing in air and exhaling air, right? But it's not as easy as it seems. There's actually a lot happening within that respiratory cycle. We need to have our lungs involved, but we also have to have a muscle that is making that happen, and that's our diaphragm. So breathing is the respiratory cycle, but in order to take an inhale or an exhale, we have to use that muscle, the diaphragm. So the diaphragm itself is right at the bottom middle part of our rib cage, or between the thoracic and the abdominal pelvic cavity is where this diaphragm is located. And what the diaphragm is doing is changing what's going on inside my thoracic cavity or my rib cage. So when you look at the picture on my screen or the picture on the bottom of 672, just look at the diaphragm at the bottom. So it has a red arc and a green arrow indicating when it's going down and when it's going up. So that is how the diaphragm muscle itself is moving everything inside our thoracic cavity. Typically, we breathe 12 to 16 times a minute, depends on what we're doing. But there is an area within our brain where our breathing is maintained. And this is going to be important for some people if you want to investigate why some people have different breathing habits than others. So keep page 672, but turn back to page 579 in our lovely chapter 23 where we talked about the brain. And when we talked about the brain, we looked at the cord, where it goes down into the spinal cord, and there was 3 areas that were located within the brain stem. And so that's where we want to remember that the medulla oblongata is located within the part that is in the brain stem. So the medulla oblongata is where the respiratory center, or what's regulating our breathing, that's where it's coming from. So back to page 672, I need my medulla oblongata to be protected within my brainstem, and it needs to be close to my brain because I need my brain to tell my body to breathe. So it does have to travel down into the diaphragm, but that's where our breathing is initiated. So sometimes when people have a neck injury, it can affect them in different ways. It just depends on where in the neck or the brain stem or the brain that the potential injury or trauma has occurred. There is also other factors that are changing how we breathe. It depends on if we're holding our breath, if we're breathing too fast, if we're breathing too slow. So there is some terms on page 672 in that box 28.1. I want you to know what those terms are there because they're describing different breathing. Some of them you might have heard of, some of them you might not have. So please be aware of those terms as well. But how we regulate our breathing is dependent on the amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide and what else is happening within our body. If you get scared, you might breathe a little faster. When you're super calm, ready to go to sleep, you're going to be breathing a little slower. If you're angry about something, your breathing could be changed, maybe faster, maybe slower, just depends. So different things within our body, different factors are going to affect our breathing. If it's cold outside, if it's hot outside, our emotions, all of those things. So breathing is a respiratory cycle that can be affected by just so many things. But what we want to look at is what actually happens when we take an inhale and when we take an exhale. So if you look at the bottom of 672, or you can look at my screen. So when we take an inhale, air is moving into our lungs. The diaphragm is actually moving down or inferiorly. So it's creating a suction to pull that air inside our nose down into our lungs. So that's how I think of it's bringing it in. We can make ourselves take an inhale even when we don't need it, but there is also a term, it's on the very end of that inhalation paragraph, it's called compliance. So it's the ease at which that happens. Sometimes it can be harder to take an inhale than others, but we can make it happen when we need to. So the opposite is an exhale. So this is when we're expelling air from out of our lungs. And if you look at the picture on the screen on the right-hand side, or the bottom of 672 on the right-hand side, you can see that the diaphragm is moving up. It's pushing up on the inside of our rib cage to expire or push everything out. We do want our rib cage and our lungs to go back to like a pause that's normal size. It has an elastic recoil to it, but we probably all experienced where I'm breathing so fast it's really hard for me to like catch my breath. So there is a difference between our inhale and our exhale. And the next time that happens to you, see how easy it is for you to control that respiratory cycle. Breathing is different than respiration. Respiration has an internal and an external exchange happening. So remember, taking a breath is a simple process of breathing in, breathing out, but we know there has to be a gas exchange, which is why we have this entire chapter. So yes, respiration is different than breathing. Respiration is when we have to get rid of that oxygen, or excuse me, get rid of that carbon dioxide and bring in the oxygen. So the exchange is happening when we have an area of high concentration moving into an area of low concentration, or the exchange is happening by diffusion. This is a product of the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system working together to make our external respiration and internal respiration happen. On page 673 is the difference between the two of them. But you don't have to memorize everything about both of these. External respiration is the gas exchange in the alveoli and the blood that's floating throughout our capillaries. So external respiration is also called pulmonary respiration. Internal respiration is the gas exchanges happening between the blood and all the rest of the cells within our body. So internal respiration is also called tissue respiration. So remembering that it has to do with either just the lungs or the rest of our body might help you know the difference between internal and external, because they're both a part of the gas exchange that needs to happen within our body. And we'll end this chapter with the things that can affect our breathing. We'll end it on a lighter note. So we know that we can sneeze, cough, hiccup, and yawn. They're all things that we've all experienced, but it depends on what my body is detecting as to the reflex that's happening. So for instance, when you look at sneeze, a sneeze is clearing something out of your upper respiratory tract, where a cough is clearing something out of your lower respiratory tract. Who knew that there was a difference? Right now you do. A hiccup is different. That is something that has happened, a reflective response. It could be to remove gas from your stomach that maybe when you went to eat or take a drink, you took an inhale, it got a little air going on in your stomach, and it needs to come out. So it's a different thought process when we think of a sneeze, a cough, or a hiccup. A yawn is something that affects our breathing. We just can't medically or research wise prove why we yawn. Is it the need to increase the oxygen or decrease the carbon dioxide? Am I bored? Am I tired? Do I just want to show somebody? I saw somebody else yawn, and so now I do. I don't know, but we just want to be aware that a sneeze, a cough, and a hiccup are different type of reflexes. A yawn, we all know what that is. We just don't know really why it happens.